Welcome to this week's episode of the Cameron's Conversations podcast. Today it is a little solo episode. So I had Louis on earlier last week and I've got Harry on a little bit later this week. But today I wanted to cover something which kind of popped into my head as I was going for my morning walk, which was actually really nice. Managed to take off a good amount of steps, 10,000 steps actually, which was a good effort for a morning walk. I was up nice and early in the sun, which was even better as well. The sunrise seems to be a lot earlier this week, which is very nice and making a bit of a change. It really does cheer you up. Bit of caffeine, bit of sunshine, makes you can feel on top of the world, which is good because I basically knocked myself out yesterday, which wasn't ideal. And it was for a really lame reason. So I've played rugby for many years, and then after that basketball for many years, and I've never had a concussion, but I decided to stand up really quickly into kind of like what's, I guess, the corner of where the window is in my family's house, like up north, and absolutely battered my head off the ceiling, which was not ideal. So I spent the pretty much all of yesterday feeling really pretty nauseous and queasy, which wasn't ideal because we were headed out for lunch only a couple hours later. So that was quite the experience. Would not recommend. So still feeling a bit nauseous today, but a little bit better, thankfully. So if this podcast is a little less coherent than normal, it's probably because I've lost some brain cells. It's very much my own fault, but my goodness, it was a sore one. So there we go. But yeah, so today's podcast is all about weight loss versus fat loss. Now, this was kind of popping into my head. So I often, before I do my podcast on a Monday morning, I give myself a bit of a walk to kind of let ideas pop into my head. And one of the most common things I see is people get really stressed out over what the scales say. And I think it can be really good to understand that this concept of that fat loss is linear, but weight loss is not linear. I'm going to explain a little bit about that. So when we think of fat loss, right, let's say I am in a 500 calorie deficit per day, pretty consistently, right? There's relatively little variance. I'm doing a good job of tracking my calories very accurately. I'm not going over on random days. It's just pretty consistent across the board. I know that across a week, I'm losing, let's say, about half a kilo, roughly. So we're going to be losing 0.5 kilos per week. The problem is that is how much fat mass I am likely to be losing, right? So that can be really steady. And that might be the case. I might lose 4 kilos of fat mass over 8 weeks. So it's really steady. But my weight could fluctuate a whole lot. I could initially lose quite a lot more weight than that because when you first go into a weight loss phase, you have that drop in water weight, food in your digestive tract, your glycogen stores, which are basically the stored form of carbohydrate. When we exercise, we tend to utilize those stores. So that sort of 1 gram of glycogen that we have, this stored form of carbohydrate, we have about 3 to 4 grams of water associated with it. So, if someone is just starting a diet and they're also hopefully exercising as well, what tends to happen is they tend to be quite responsive. They tend to see quite a big drop in that first week because we see this drop in water weight. We see the sort of depletion of glycogen stores a little bit as well. We also see the drop from food in the digestive tract. And on top of that, we see actual fat loss as well, which of course means that people can see quite a lot of movement in the first week. Now, of course, actually that can go the other direction where sometimes people will absolutely be smashing it. They will be dropping their 0.5 kilos of fat, body fat, we'll just say for simplicity's sake in this sort of podcast. So they are losing that half a kilo per week, but of course the weight can fluctuate for lots of reasons. So I'm going to take one of the most common and obvious ones. If you're female, you've got a menstrual cycle, or even if you've got any hormonal fluctuations, so if you can kind of perimenopause, etc., like there's still going to be fluctuations there as well from hormones too. So what is going to happen is you are going to have fluctuations that have nothing to do with fat mass, body fat, if you like. There's no impact on that at all. You've still lost your half a kilo a week, but what you've actually seen is a spike on the scales. The scales have gone up a little bit, or they've potentially plateaued for that week. And it's actually just because of hormonal fluctuations. So let's say a little bit more water retention or bloating or all these kind of things that can factor in as well. So that's a really common one. And I see that with a lot of female clients where we're a few months into one-to-one coaching. We have a really good idea of what the rhythm and routine, I guess, of their kind of weight fluctuations are. So we're pretty clear on kind of what to expect. So it makes it a little bit easier. But before that point in time, it can be really frustrating. And this is where a lot of people go wrong. And this is why I'm so passionate about this topic in particular, is that that person can be doing brilliantly. They can be dropping half a kilo every single week, doing really well with their nutrition. They can have a week where their weight spikes for something that's out with their control. So I've mentioned something to do with like menstrual cycle fluctuations, and I'll stick with that example first. But let's say that that's exactly why they're at that kind of point in their cycle that their weight tends to spike up, and they feel like, oh, this diet isn't working, I'm failing, and then they eat to compensate. Or sometimes, when I say that, eat to compensate, I mean that they restrict their calories down a lot and they try and really reduce them. And of course, because it's that point in their cycle, they're feeling a bit demotivated by the weight. It all just kind of falls to bits and they feel like they're failing. And then they end up overeating, or they swing the other way. And in the first instance, they react to the scales going up and think it's not working. So they overeat because they're feeling bad about it, feeling negative about the fact they're quote unquote failing, which they obviously bloody aren't. It's just a scale weight fluctuation. But this is so important because actually that throws a lot of people off. Now, that's just one example, but there's lots of other ones. So another example is, it's like my weight spiked up quite a bit this morning, but I also had like quite a bit of popcorn yesterday. Like I just had a bag of like salted popcorn and shared it with my girlfriend when we were driving up the road. I quite like it as a snack. I find it's relatively filling. I quite like a savoury snack as well, still comfortably within my calories. So it worked well. I had a piece of fruit, had some popcorn for something a little bit savoury. I'd not had popcorn in quite a while actually, I think a couple of months, and I just quite fancied it. So it was quite nice to have, but it's also salty. And I don't tend to eat a lot of salty foods. So unsurprisingly, my weight was up on the scales this morning. And for a lot of people, that would throw them into a bit of a panic or a fluster, and they get stressed and be like, oh, why's my weight gone up? And it's like, well, my calories were in a good place, but I'm also going to see a little bit of a spike from having saltier food. And there's all these other factors that can impact your weight that don't impact fat loss. It is irrelevant to my fat loss that I have had popcorn, for example, right, with a bit of salt in it. That has no impact on my progress. I'm still in a calorie deficit. Let's say I'm in a calorie deficit of 500 a day. It has a zero impact on that whatsoever. But when I step on the scales, well, the scales are going to be up. And again, one of the things is we forget is that we're more susceptible to weight fluctuations when we are dieting. I'm more susceptible to that because I'm probably having, like I don't tend to eat a lot of salty foods anyway, so that probably makes me a bit more susceptible to it anyway. But you've got that and the fact that it's not something I'm having regularly, right? So it's more likely to influence it. Where in another context where my calories are significantly higher, so if I was eating 500-600 calories higher at maintenance, well, the chances are the overall amount of salt in my diet is a little bit higher just by sort of virtue of there being more food in my diet, full stop. So I'm less likely to be as responsive to it. The same applies to when people see little kind of fluctuations on the scales when they have a higher carbohydrate meal. Well, you are more likely to see that in a weight loss phase. Why? Because, well, you're restricting your calories. You are probably eating less carbohydrate than normal. So when you have a higher carbohydrate meal, you see a bigger spike on the scales. If you were at maintenance, you would see you might still see a spike, but you're probably going to see less of a spike because actually the amount of carbohydrate you have day to day is higher anyway. So I often try and frame it to like that to clients and anyone that I'm working with in Sorting 6, for example, where I will say, remember that you are more susceptible to weight fluctuations when you are in a weight loss phase than when you are at maintenance or where you were eating normally before, right? That is common. You are going to find if you save or bank a lot of your calories for a Saturday because you've got a big meal out, you have that meal out on the Sunday, you often do see quite a big spike in weight. That's not a reflection of your average calories being over. And this is one of the things that I do with my one-to-one clients and Sorting 6 clients, is we always work on average calories. We don't get stressed out about the day-to-day variations. We need to have some wiggle room. But this is really, really important, is that I could do that. I could bank an extra couple hundred calories Monday to Friday, which gives me an extra 1,000 for Saturday, which is a good chunk more food. I have an extra 1,000 calories on Saturday, and then I get sort of stressed out because on a Sunday my weight is spiked up, and it's like, well, what did you expect? You've eaten 1,000 calories more food. You're not in a calorie surplus for the week. Your average weight loss will be the same as it would have been for the entire week. That's absolutely fine. But it's just a weight fluctuation. And I think that's really, really important because a lot of the time we get really, really caught up in this idea of like, oh, well, my weight hasn't dropped so much this week. And it's like, have you stuck to your calories? Have you tracked accurately? Have you been on top of things in terms of like your movement? Is your movement around average? Your steps are in a good place? You're training still, you're exercising still. If those things are in place, if your calories are tracked well, you're hitting your targets, you're moving as much as normal, you'll still have lost that body fat, right? It's just a weight fluctuation. And I think that really helps if you can get into that mindset of the scales can give us a really good guide if we take a bit of a step back from them. So if we look over a 2-week period, a 3-week period, a 4-week period, you start to see a really clear trend. And if over a 4 to 6 week period weight hasn't dropped so much, then that's maybe an indicator that we do need to make some changes, right? That we need to make some tweaks in terms of calories, or potentially be more accurate with calorie tracking, or more adherent to our calories. We need to stick to it better. But a lot of the time, the week-to-week, day-to-day fluctuations are a lot more variable than people think, and it does not reflect your progress. I cannot stress that enough. Having done quite a big weight loss phase, had weeks where the scales barely moved. They moved by like 0.1 kilos, yet I'd look at progress photos and measurements and I would see a really significant difference. And that was a really good, I mean, obviously you know these things objectively, but experiencing that multiple times when I lost a significant amount of weight, it really helps, because then you're kind of like, yeah, that's normal. Like sometimes the scales won't fluctuate, and actually, they will fluctuate and they won't drop the way you expect. Yeah, I still look leaner. My measurements are down. I can see in the mirror, I can see in my clothing that I'm leaner. Doesn't matter that much. And I think that's really important. I'm a big fan of like daily weigh-ins and having the scales as a metric. But one of the reasons I like to do it daily with clients is because it becomes like a little bit uninteresting. Like you start to lose the focus on it. You don't become as obsessed with it a lot of the time as you do when you do a weekly weigh-in, and you get very focused and you put all this pressure around it. Actually, the pressure tends to come off. So I think that's a really nice way to kind of start to think about like weight loss versus fat loss. Is you can be in a 500 calorie deficit per day for 4 or 5 days and see weight creep up if it's related to other factors, right? And of course, you know, I made the example there, if someone has a big meal out on Saturday, they're within their average calories. Sunday they weigh a bit more, Monday it's trending down, Tuesday it's trending, but it might take a couple of days for it to drop down, especially if that was a meal that, again, was higher in carbohydrates, a bit saltier than normal, as it often is when we eat out. All these kind of things can factor in. So it is well worth being quite reflective, I think, on exactly what we're expecting from the scales. On average, they will drop. You should take your week-to-week averages. Most of the time that will drop. But even then, week-to-week, there will be fluctuations. And if you're female, recognizing that in your menstrual cycle, and then outside of that for anyone, just recognizing trends. Did you have salty food yesterday? Well, why would you stress yourself out about that? If you ate at 9 p.m. when you normally eat at 7, that doesn't have any impact on fat loss. But of course, you're going to weigh a little bit more in the morning because, well, you had it 2 hours later. You ate closer to the time that you weigh in. So all these things factor in, and I think it can be useful to reflect on that. So just wanted to touch on that a little bit. And of course, if you are struggling with weight loss a little bit and you're finding yourself very frustrated with the scales and you are tempted to throw them out the window, please don't. That might be a bit of a danger for passers-by. Then there is going to be a link in the show notes for one-to-one coaching, which is where we deep dive into all things nutrition, training, make sure you've got the accountability there to actually stick it out this time, but mostly to learn how to sustain this long term, because it's not just about weight loss for me as a coach. That's obviously a key bit. We want you to get there, get the result, feel really bloody good, but I want you to keep it off long term too. And that is the real magic, right? Is when we can lose all that weight and then we can keep it off for life. So if you do have any kind of questions or anything like that, you can pop me a message on Instagram, or you can jump to the link in the show notes for one-to-one coaching, and I'll speak to you soon.